So the next thinker that I will just briefly share the ideas of with you is has been very much inspired by Kant. So he represents a modern installment in the Kantian tradition. Of course, he is influenced by other thinkers as well, but described his own theory as a Kantian one repeatedly, and is often classified as a Kantian thinker. And I think you'll see why in just a moment. So his most famous book is A Theory of Justice, where he puts forward exactly that, which the title gives. And he says that justice is the standard for an ethically good society. Okay, so justice has to do with how society is ordered, and in particular, Rawls is interested in how different rights and opportunities and other social goods are distributed in society. So that includes things like wealth, but it also includes things like positions of authority and prestige and enjoyment of free time and other things like that. So any kind of good thing in life that the social order can either allow someone to enjoy or can somehow get in the way of someone enjoying, it counts as a good in that sense. And a just society, one of the criteria of a just society is that it distributes goods in a just way. In other words, that people have access to the goods that they ought to have access to. And so part of what he does in this book is make a case for what the principle should be or what the standard should be that tells us which goods people should have access to. So the question that Rawls asks is, how can we determine what the principles of justice are? In other words, how can we tell what is the standard for a just distribution of goods in society? And his answer to that question is something he calls the original position. So I'm going to describe this and also the principles that he arrives at on the basis of this course of reasoning. And then I'll say a little bit about what its implications are and why this argument as a whole is often thought to be a Kantian one. So the original position is this. It's an imaginary scenario where before a society is set up, everyone meets and makes a decision about what the rules of the society will be. So if you think about it, if everybody gets to come together and make a decision, then that already seems like a fair scenario, right? It seems like if everybody's going to be a part of society, then they all ought to have a say in how that society is organized. So that much is something that's kind of intuitive or common sense for us about what counts as fairness, right? Everybody ought to have an equal say in how things are set up. But what Rawls also asks us to imagine here is that these people make a decision behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. In particular, they don't know whether, once the society gets going, they will be a member of a higher class or a lower class in terms of wealth. They don't know what race they will be. They don't know whether they'll be male or female. They don't know whether they'll have a disability or not. They won't know how talented they are, and so on. So the idea here is that when people are deliberating about how to set up society in the original position, which again is a kind of imagined scenario, they don't know all of these features about about what kind of person they will be and what kind of experiences they will have in the real society that gets set up after they make their decisions. And Rawls thinks that this is a good scenario to imagine because it requires that people make decisions about what counts as a fair setup for society without considering various kinds of accidents, things that they can't control, and therefore they shouldn't either be privileged or lose some privilege or lose some rights as a result of, since those are all things that they can't themselves control. So the intuition here is it would be wrong for a person to have less goods in society simply because they were a woman, since being a woman is not something that people can control. It's not something that they can choose. And so it's unjust or unfair to disadvantage someone in society just because they're a woman. So what we're going to do to try to come up with fair rules for society is imagine that the deliberation about the rules is occurring in the original position, which means behind a veil of ignorance, where people don't know which demographic category they will fit into once society actually gets going. Rawls then argues that in the original position, people would agree to the following two principles, and these end up being his answer to the question of what is the standard for a just society. Okay, so one is that each person will have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty, that is freedom to speak or freedom to move, etc., compatible with a similar liberty for others. So whatever amount of freedom you can imagine that's maximized individual or personal freedom, okay, so long as it also allows every other individual in society to have a maximum personal freedom. That is something that everybody in the original position would agree to. Again, they don't know what position in society they'll have, but how could they not want to have a maximum amount of freedom consistent with the freedom of everybody else, right? That would be a very good principle to sign up for or agree to for anybody in the original position. And the second principle is that Rawls thinks people will agree to in the original position, behind the veil of ignorance, is that social and economic inequalities will be arranged so that they are reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and they're attached to positions and offices open to all. So what's interesting here is that Rawls doesn't think that the people in the original position or behind a veil of ignorance would agree to have a society that is maximally equal as far as the distribution of social and economic goods is concerned. So in other words, he doesn't think people would agree to a society where everybody has exactly the same income or everybody has exactly the same kinds of professional responsibilities. They wouldn't agree to a completely equal society in that sense. But they would agree to the principle that whenever things are unequal, they must meet these two criteria, that the inequality has to actually benefit everyone, including those who occupy the less well-off positions. So if the society is one where some people make more money than others, then the fact that some people make more money than others has to benefit even those who make less money. Okay, and it's possible that such a arrangement is in fact the case, as economists have argued for a long time, because sometimes wealth disparities are a necessary part of improving the well-being of everybody, even the least well-off. So that's a point that Rawls is conceding to those economists who've made those arguments. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. The other criterion is that these inequalities have to be attached to positions and offices that are open to all. In other words, it can't be that some position is one that a person is just not eligible for simply because they're a woman or simply because they have a disability or they're a member of a certain race and so on. So it has to be that all the different positions in society and the different kinds of goods in society are available to people if they adequately work for them and demonstrate their competence and so on. Okay, so it has to be at least in principle possible for those positions to be occupied by anyone. So I want to speak very briefly about one of the interesting economic policy implications of this. And this argument's been very influential in particularly like centrist left thinking, so kind of like moderate Democrat type thinking about economic policy. This is a very popular idea. Okay, so look at three possible income distributions in society, A, B, and C. Notice that in A, all of the individuals have roughly the same income. In B, all of the individuals have a higher income than in A, but one of the individuals has a much higher income. So 4 of the individuals, and this is just sort of example data points. We're supposed to imagine this is characteristic of a larger society. So you could think of each of these points in the graph as representing, thousands or tens of thousands of individuals as a kind of average. So in condition B, okay, in this society, we have one where everybody makes about 1,500. I don't know if these are dollars or some other unit, but is at an income level of 1.5K. Okay, but one individual is at an income level of 5K, so much, much greater than everybody else. And then in the third society, we have one where 4 of the individuals have incomes just below 3K, but one of the individuals has an income slightly higher than the others. So Rawls's argument, and this is part of what the second principle of justice amounts to, Rawls's argument is that the fairest society out of these 3, and the one that the people in the original position would be most likely to agree to, okay, is C. C is the best option among these 3, okay? Why is that? Because, well, clearly C is better than A. Well, let me put it this way. A is the most equal of all 3, right? B is the least equal of all 3, and C is somewhere in between the 2. But what's most important in the contrast between B and C is that in C we've lowered the well-being of the very top earner, the 5K person, okay? But by choosing to lower that income, or in accordance with lowering that income of the very top earner, okay, we've also raised the income of 4 of the other earners, all right? And the argument here is not a utilitarian one. It's not that there's greater overall well-being, because if it were simply a utilitarian argument, then it would be okay to have one person earn 20K and everybody else just earn 1K, and that would be better than a case where everybody earns a little bit more than 1K, okay? But that's not what Rawls is saying. What he's saying is that in order to justify an inequality, that is, in order to justify C over A, one has to have improved the well-being of everybody in the society. And in fact, that's what happens with C. So that's why it's preferable. One more point here. So for Rawls, B is also preferable to A. It's just not preferable to C, because C improves the well-being of those other 4 individuals as well, even though the one individual doesn't do as well in C as he or she did in B. So the point here is you have to choose between A and B. If that's the only choice, you should choose B. But if you have to choose between A, B, and C, then you should choose C. And it doesn't matter how high up that one dot goes within B. That one dot in B could be at 20K. But you still would need to pick C over B because it raises the condition of the least well-off when you pick C, and that's what makes it the best choice. So this kind of Rawlsian argument has been used to argue for more taxation on the wealthy in the United States, because if you look at the increase in wages over the course of the past 30 years, as demonstrated in this chart, 30 or 40 years, as demonstrated in this chart, the lowest earners, their wages have actually decreased in terms of their buying power, whereas the wages of middle wage and high wage employees or workers have gone up, and the very highest wages have gone up significantly. So another way to put this is the rich are getting richer and richer and richer. You know, they're getting richer percentage-wise. They're getting richer every year, every 5-10 year period at a higher rate, whereas the poor are getting poorer over that same period of time. And so a Rawlsian argument would be, okay, look, it may be that having a free market economy generates a lot of wealth. That makes sense. And that wealth is good for people in lots of ways. It's good for the society in lots of ways. But the problem is that if that wealth that's generated overall doesn't benefit the least well-off in society, then it's not fair to go on allowing for the lives of the least well-off to get worse. Maybe the overall gross national product is skyrocketing, but if the well-being of the least well-off is not improving or is actually decreasing, then that means that we're in a state in the society that someone in the original position, if they didn't know where they would end up in society, whether they'd be a low wage earner or a high wage earner, they wouldn't agree to that arrangement. No one would agree to live in a society like this one because they might be disadvantaged by where they end up in the society. Okay, so this is an argument that it is justified to redistribute the wealth from some of the very highest wage earners to some of the low wage earners that aren't benefiting from this increase in productivity and wealth and so on. And this Rawlsian argument is a Kantian one. It's thought to be a Kantian one because it's focused on justice or fairness, or what it takes to treat each individual as having a right to decide for themselves what kind of life they want to live without treating any one individual's preferences as privileged over those of another. So it respects the autonomy or the personhood of everybody in a society, even the least well-off. It's a way of, you could say, respecting the personhood of everyone in society to hold a society to the standard of the two principles of justice. So the last contemporary theorist that I want to briefly look at is Martha Nussbaum, who is most famous for her work on something called the capabilities approach, which is a ethical approach, contemporary approach that is inspired by Aristotle and virtue ethics. Nussbaum has written about this approach in many places, but I want to introduce it to you just by looking at the first paragraph from her book from 2000 called Women and Human Development, the Capabilities Approach. So this first paragraph actually gives a pretty good sense of what is going to be emphasized in the capabilities approach. She writes, women in much of the world lack support for fundamental functions of a human life. They are less well-nourished than men, less healthy, more vulnerable to physical violence and sexual abuse. They're much less likely than men to be literate and still less to have professional or technical education. Should they attempt to enter the workplace, they face greater obstacles, including sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and without effective legal recourse. Many obstacles impede their participation in political life. They don't have the same property rights as men. They don't have the same rights of association, mobility, and religious liberty. They are often taxed to provide work, that is employment, and also do housework and childcare. They lack opportunities for play and for the cultivation of their imaginative and cognitive faculties. And these things also take a toll on their emotional well-being. Okay, so what we have here is a list of lots of different things about human lives that we have good reason to believe make human lives worth living or make them good or happy for the people who live them. Okay, they include things like health and nourishment and freedom from attack, from physical violence. Okay, they include things like education and literacy. They include, the ability to learn things and to teach oneself things, which literacy is a big prerequisite of, right? I mean, it's a major contributor to an individual's ability to teach themselves about the world, to answer their own questions. Their ability to people's ability to participate in politics, in leadership in their communities, their capacities for imaginative use of their imaginative and cognitive faculties, and for play, what Nussbaum calls play, just any kind of creative or fun activity. So these are all examples of things that make human lives worth living to the people who live them, that make lives satisfying to the people who live them. And the capabilities approach asks us in our ethics to focus on those things. And so from a policy standpoint, it says what we ought to be doing is enhancing human capabilities. We should be fostering human capabilities, helping people around the world, including, for instance, women in developing countries who suffer from these various restrictions on their capabilities. We should be helping all human beings to have access to and enjoy all of these capabilities. So there's something about the capabilities approach that is like utilitarianism in that it's talking about a certain result as what it is that we should be fostering. And it describes that result, at least in quasi-quantitative terms, because it's describing a number of different capabilities, and it's possible to give metrics for those things to say, what's the percentage of literacy in a given place? What's the percentage of what's the life expectancy in a given place, and so on. But because it's looking at many different facets of human life and not just pleasure and pain as utilitarianism does, okay, it's a more plural and more diverse account of the various things that we should be trying to foster in our behavior and in our policy. And so from that standpoint, the capabilities approach is kind of like an expanded utilitarianism or a Aristotelian utilitarianism, because it's what it's trying to foster is the living of a full human life for as many human beings as possible. And that idea of a full human life, a life that involves these many different character attributes and patterns of behavior that are a part of the happiness of a human life, that idea is very clearly inspired by Aristotle in Nussbaum's work. So that's part of where Nussbaum is getting the idea, is from Aristotle, and she herself describes it that way. Well, that brings us to the end of this review of ethical theories, including this brief introduction to some contemporary authors who are working within these three traditions.